So I'm really delighted to be kicking off Founders Week with this session with Jade Buchanan. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce him. He's a partner at the firm of McCarthy Titro, which is one of the largest firms in Canada. He was recently, and this is quite significant, congratulations, Jade, selected as one of the leading 40 under 40 data lawyers by the Global Data Review. His job is to help clients comply with privacy law and understand and mitigate the legal risks associated with cybersecurity. This includes helping to develop response plans, serving as part of multidisciplinary response teams, and even, sort of as he says, writing the privacy policies that we all just love to read. I think we can say that we have no better expert to help us navigate some of the issues around cybersecurity for startups and entrepreneurs. Jade is joining us from Vancouver, so it's a morning. Welcome. I think I'll kick off the session, if you don't mind, by just sort of reflecting a little bit on the fact that these days you can't actually sort of look at or read the news or listen to the news without hearing about a new cyber attack or around the world. So just last week, we learned that Newfoundland's health care system, that it suffered the largest cyber attack in Canadian history. And I know it's not just public institutions that are vulnerable. There are at least sort of US estimates that suggest that small companies, 1 to 49 employees, lost an average of $24,000 each in 2020 to cybercrime. And that, of course, escalates from medium-sized companies, 50 to 249 employees, which lost an average of $50,000 each in 2020. And you don't have to be a tech company to feel the effects of cybercrime. So by way of general introduction, Jade, could I ask you to explain a little bit about the state of cybercrime in Canada? And if you could offer, I know you're going to talk about this a little bit later, but just some introductory remarks about the practical consequences or impacts of cybercrime on businesses.
Thank you for that introduction, Myra, and for crediting my work with all the great privacy policies that I write. So cybersecurity, obviously, if you, as Myra mentioned, pay attention to the news, has gone to being something that's top of mind, where in large companies, it's reached a level of the board where there's now expectations that board, at least one board member have a level of cybersecurity expertise. And you usually have board members and senior executives participating in preparedness for cybersecurity incidents. There's all kinds of different reports you can point to that show that this is a big concern for the public sector and for businesses. Several years ago, now the Senate of Canada released a report called Cybercrime. It should keep you up at night, which is quite a alarmist, but maybe appropriately alarmist title. And it, you can even see things like the Biden administration now responding to attacks on American businesses. A lot of the risk around cybersecurity is legal risk, and that's people often think, why do I need a lawyer when I have a cybersecurity incident? And the reason is a lot of what can go wrong is legal risk to you, and meaning that's you getting sued, or you facing regulatory action where a privacy commissioner investigates the source of what went wrong in your breach. And coming soon, there will be fines for it in Canada. There currently are not, but Quebec has passed laws that will introduce fines that you can suffer if your cybersecurity practices are inadequate. And we expect different laws throughout the rest of Canada to be coming soon. Plus, by their nature, tech companies are working cross-border, and so there's big fines in the European Union that are a risk. When it comes to small and medium-sized enterprises, the incidents we tend to see are obviously ransomware attacks. That's everywhere, and ransomware has gone from, when I started doing this, I think my first one maybe 5 years ago was a ransomware attack where it locked down the entire, we'd lock down systems, but it wouldn't steal any data in the process. Now hackers are typically exfiltrating some data. Exfiltration is I don't know why we use that jargony word for take, but hackers are taking data and locking systems down. So they're ransoming the data back to the business, and they are locking them out of their systems to create a bunch of urgency to pay that ransom. There's a third layer now that I heard about theoretically about a year ago, and then I started actually seeing very recently, where they'll do these very targeted extortion attempts. So they'll comb through the data they steal, and then they'll look for things like personal information that might be a bit embarrassing to an individual. So they might look for medical records. They might look for the last one I worked on, somebody was sent an email with their own will attached, which may have had sensitive information on it, depending how they were dividing up their estate between their children. It was sent to them saying, if you don't pay us, we're going to release your inbox publicly. The other one that's really common is business email compromise, where hackers will get into a executive's inbox, and typically they'll start rediverting funds. They'll email people who are responsible for paying bills and say, we've changed our payment information, go send money from here to here. And you wouldn't necessarily think this, but as a business, you could be liable if you're the one hacked, or you could be liable if you're the one who falls victim to the hack. If you're responsible for sending money to one of your suppliers, you redirect it to a hacker. The supplier may or may not, or your customer may or may not be liable for that. So it's something that both parties need to look out for. And then ultimately reputation is a factor as well. I have worked on a deal recently where it was a tech startup that had grown to a pretty good size. And then it had a data breach. It was outed for, I can't tell details, but it was outed for doing something that was perceived by its customers as being an overcollection of personal information. And as a result, the value of the business plummeted quite a bit. It's hard to give an estimate, but it was, it was a significant loss of money for the founders, because they got acquired at a price that probably was much lower than they would have had they did not had this incident. So I think it's important to understand cybersecurity law, because it helps you tailor the risk, and the easiest time to start addressing cybersecurity risks is day one. So for example, this company I just mentioned that was devalued as a result of their practices, they could have avoided this by collecting less personal information. And that's usually one of the things you can do to think about managing your own risks. And I'll talk about it in the context of mandatory breach notification. So in Canada, at the federal level and in Alberta and Quebec and in certain sectors in different provinces, there's mandatory breach notification. And what that means, if you're hacked and personal information is accessed or stolen from your systems, you have a legal obligation to potentially notify the privacy commissioner and notify all the affected individuals. And that's really, like, it's not fun to send an email to all your customers saying, hey, we got hacked, here's what was taken. Maybe offer credit monitoring and identity theft insurance, but really it's just a reputational ding. If it's not going to cause harm to the individuals, you don't need to report it. So if it's potentially just, say, some metadata with maybe some IP addresses, can't really be tied to any one individual, you may not have a reporting obligation. But once you get anything sensitive, you do. So I've seen a lot of businesses do really creative things in reducing the amount of personal information they collect and retain, et cetera. Examples are, if you're collecting like a healthcare number to identify people, like determine, do you need the whole number or can you use the last 3 digits? Do you need a full email address, or can you X out, can you hash some of the characters out? Are there ways of storing information separately so that if you get hacked on one system, they're not getting anything sensitive? All those different kinds of things can be useful in helping you mitigate the legal risk, and knowing about mandatory breach notification is one way.
Can I just ask a follow-up on terms of what you've been saying? Sort of, you're thinking about it, from, let's say, the startup perspective, where they have limited resources. What are some of the things that you would recommend that they think about in terms of being able? I mean, obviously there are legal obligations that you mentioned under privacy laws and data collection, sort of data protection laws in Canada and elsewhere around the world. But how would you sort of approach it? Sort of thinking about a startup with limited resources.
It's a really good question. I'd say, fortunately, for one thing, there are a lot of free resources out there for startups that can help you think about your own cybersecurity. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity has a small and medium-sized enterprises controls document, but there are other kind of control documents out there that give you advice on how to build cybersecurity into your platforms, into your systems. So look at those. And then there's just a lot of really great general like free advice out there around how do you maximize the tools you do have to have things like multi-factor authentication. And there's lots of template privacy impact assessments out there that you can use just to do your own kind of assessment. So you don't necessarily need to go spend a lot of money on cybersecurity, consultants and software, but first off, have somebody within your organization who's responsible for cybersecurity and is thinking about it. That person, I always say it's good to just keep this thing top of mind by following some cybersecurity Twitter accounts or adding some to your regular news feed. So you're seeing this stuff on a regular basis and you're just advertising it to yourself. And then also to take those steps to use some of those free resources that are out there. There's like a free resource for everybody. I listen to a weekly podcast called Risky Business that talks about cybersecurity news, and it's something I enjoy listening to. It's maybe fortunately an interesting topic to hear what's going on in the world of cybercrime, and it helps you stay alive to it. Warning though, it can make you a little paranoid sometimes. Further down the line, you're going to have consumer contracts likely if you launch a product. So that might be your terms of use if you're launching a smartphone app. But if you're B2B, then it's going to be a contract with business customers. They're going to expect a high degree of liability be assigned to a customer or to a vendor in their contracts typically, especially if they're dealing with a startup. So be prepared to negotiate that and see what you can get. Down the line, these are insurable risks to an extent, but cyber insurance has gone from being kind of a niche product to something that everybody really commonly has, but it's now gotten quite expensive and quite difficult to get.
Can I ask then too, like in some cases, for example, you're a small business, you've got a web presence, you've got an internet service provider, they're providing some level of, they maintain some level of, security, sort of, online security. They provide you with those kinds of guarantees. So a third party provider that is, hosting or sort of, managing the website. Would you advise relying on kind of their representations about their, the strength or robustness of their practices? Again, as a way of, passing on some of the, the obligation, especially as an early stage company, sort of could you rely, I guess, on your, internet service provider to be able to manage some of the risk with you?
Yeah, there's a lot of different services you're going to necessarily rely on, whether it's you're using G Suite for, your document management, or you're hosting on AWS, you're using, Office 365, all those kinds of products are going to have built-in security. And in some sense, you're probably, you probably feel safer having your data hosted on big cloud providers infrastructure than you do having like hosting it on your local drives, because I've worked on a number of cybersecurity incidents where it was just good old-fashioned theft. Smash and grabs are a real problem where people are never leave your laptop in your car for any reason, or your smartphone, but it does happen where people leave a device in their car and there's a smash and grab and it's stolen, and then it's really hard to image what was on the machine to even know what data was breached. Similarly, I've seen, to tie this to the point of using third-party infrastructure, I've seen actual physical break-ins. Actually, one where the thieves broke into it was a mini mall, and they broke into the dentist's office, presumably for laughing gas, but next door was my client's business, and they actually smashed a wall that turned out to be the wall to the safe, where a bunch of personal records were kept. And so those records were stolen, and we had to, figure out the breach reporting obligations around that. But they could have just as easily stolen devices or a server. So if it's not the worst thing to be using servers that are, in a very safe data center operated by a reputable party, because if their data centers are compromised physically, they've got a lot of money and reputation on the line there. So there's a really strong incentive for them to have good security. Now, in their actual contracts, which are going to be like take it or leave it contracts, they're not going to accept any liability, or they'll expect the minimum they think they can get away with. So you don't have a lot of expectations there. But all this is to say, I mean, with a big player, you can rely on them, and you can go look and see what ISO certificates they have and how they comply with NIST cybersecurity standards and all the rest of all the work they do to be secure. Vendors are often the cause or failure to prevent a cybersecurity incident. I've worked on 2 this past, since the summer, involving call centers where this is a COVID related one where people were using outsourced call centers to provide services. These call centers went to work from home when they used to be in secure facilities where the call center agents couldn't even bring their smartphone into the facility. They go through a metal detector and whatever. Then they go work at home, and all of a sudden you have instances of people they live with, we think, peeking over their shoulder and taking photos of customer records, calling those customers and trying to get them to divert their payment, or threatening them, saying, we've got your personal information, we'll leak it. Or calling the business and saying, we're going to contact your customers and tell them you sell their personal information, as a way of kind of extorting the business. So that's one example of vendors being a source of the incident. Another one, we had an analytics company that was supposed to be collecting usage data about how customers were using a website. And in most credit card information, if you're a startup, you're getting your credit card information handled by, Stripe or another third-party service provider. So you don't have to handle credit card information. It's kind of ideal not to. But this analytics company essentially had a keylogger installed on the website. So it was picking up everything people typed in. And so it picked up credit cards. And so as you can imagine, once credit card data gets stolen, that's potentially a really big breach. So to that end, it's useful to understand what your vendors are offering in terms of cybersecurity, what they're actually doing. And then on your side, making sure you're using them properly and that you've got them configured properly, ideally configured to collect as little information as possible. It's another mindset thing where I think a lot of people get in their heads that like data is the new oil. But before you start collecting it, decide if you're an oil company, because otherwise, you got a spill on your hands that you don't know how to deal with. Build your systems to collect all the data you want, but don't collect it until you've got a real plan for it and you know what you're going to do with it. Just, don't just hope that it's going to be really valuable one day. So that's kind of thinking about vendors. There's safety in reputable vendors, but it's not a guarantee, and you're never going to be able to explain to a privacy commissioner, well, I was using, AWS, so it's not my fault. Unfortunately, they won't take that, even though I think that's maybe a pretty good answer. They're not going to take it as one.
Well, that leads us to the next question, which really is about, you talked about the mandatory obligations that the law imposes on companies for, if there's a breach, those kinds of things. What are some of the other legal issues that come into play, sort of the legal vulnerability, let's say, of companies in that are subjected to sort of cyber attacks or cyber crime?
Yeah, I can kind of talk you through all the suffering that happens when we go through one of these incidents. Because the way the legal team gets involved is ideally we help with planning, and we do a tabletop exercise where we simulate what it would be like to go through a breach. Those are fun. Like going through those are actually enjoyable exercise, and if you can set aside time to simulate a breach with your organization, it's a good idea. And then we prepare those plans, and as a startup, you think, I don't have the resources for a big cybersecurity incident plan. I don't think you need a big one. At least a big one can be, just a bunch of work that doesn't actually work well for your actual incident. But it's worth having just a one-pager it's mostly phone numbers of people you need to contact if you've got an incident, depending on your size of who to help, of who can help you. It's going to have a cybersecurity firm. It's going to have your lawyer. It's going to have potentially a forensic auditor to help assess went wrong. And it may have a list of the customers you need to notify when you have an incident. Usually customers will appreciate a level of transparency. You can have like the more complicated cybersecurity incident plans are 30 pages long, but it's better to have a one pager than nothing at all. And the key on the one pager is just really the contact information. So going through those, if you can set a morning aside to do an incident tabletop exercise, I recommend it. When the actual incident hits, it's an all hands on deck exercise, and there is so anecdotally, it happens on Thursday or Friday night or over the weekend. And this is by design, where cyber criminals know, A, if you've got alerts being monitored, they're more likely to be ignored, and B, the teams are in more of a scramble. Now, if you're at this stage, the FBI last week released a private businesses advisory saying that cyber criminals are now waiting for big events that are going to put pressure on businesses to pay ransom right away. And they listed IPOs and M&As. It used to be years ago that cyber criminals were hacking into professional services firms and getting data about M&As, so they would know if it had like a stock price impact, and they would buy stock and then sell the stock after it went up after the announcement and make money that way, kind of privately. But that's a little bit easier to trace because of big trades get monitored, especially around big events, and it's hard to own stock anonymously the way it's a little easier to own cryptocurrency anonymously. So these hacks are happening at the most inopportune times, and that's kind of when to expect it. If you want to be mean to your staff, you can spring it on them that way and do your tabletop exercise on Thursday night. So we work through these exercises, and yeah, first part of the pain is that it's really not a fun exercise for the team to go through. It's really stressful. It keeps you up at night. It diverts your attention away from building your business. And then if you've got to start sending notices, so your contracts with your customers, if you're doing a B2B business, are likely going to say that if you have a cyber attack of any nature, it doesn't matter if risk is coming out of it or not, you've got to notify them. And it could be even further in terms of level of detail. Like, I know how it is in startup world. You get your customer's contract. They say, sign this if you want us to start paying you, and you need the cash. So you sign up. But you've signed up to a long list of incident response obligations, including notifying them when you have an incident, providing them as much information as they want in relation to the incident, helping them notify their customers if they've got downstream obligations, and then being financially on the hook for a lot of it. So those contracts can be a big source of risk. Ransom is a big source of financial losses. Business email compromise, like diverted payments, big source of financial loss. And there's some, I've heard both numbers, that ransomware is the most significant in terms of causing financial losses, and also that the business email compromise is still actually quietly the most significant source of losses. With ransomware too, you've got, to the extent you've got anything on-prem, you've got to then rebuild those systems or pay the ransom, and that's ransomware takers are asking a lot of money these days. It went from tens of thousands of dollars to I've worked on several this year where they're asking for millions, which doesn't make sense in the context of a startup. And they're negotiating. I mean, this is a business. It's a very complicated and organized criminal enterprise. It's become even like segregated, where you've got one party develops a ransomware, another party hacks into the businesses and sells the hack business, and then a third party deploys the ransomware and they share the profits with the ransomware, like the software designer. So I'm getting off into a tangent there, but it's become a huge business, and I suspect that the fact that insurance companies are paying out huge premium or paying out huge claims on these are further driving up the costs. And then notifying your customers and the privacy commissioner is all uncomfortable things that you don't have to be that big to get sued in a class action lawsuit. You just need a lot of customer records, and the class actions lawyers need to think that you've got enough. I have seen, they're not startups, but medium-sized businesses that started, 5 years ago were a startup, grow, have a data breach, and then have it be big enough that class action counsel is coming after them. But also as a startup, you might be an attack vector for your biggest customers. And so when you see those big contracts, there's a reason they're so worried, is that their security is only as good as their weakest vendor. And so they can be wary of cybersecurity practices. Now, conversely, as a startup, if you can show that you've got a mature-ish cybersecurity program by doing things like being able to provide information on what cybersecurity standard you follow, and being able to say things like, we've never had a serious incident, we've got a head of cybersecurity, those kinds of things can help you win business by giving your customers some comfort that you've taken steps on cybersecurity. If you can show other things like you don't collect a lot of personal data, you've done data minimization, those things are helpful as well, because a big organization is going to do a privacy impact assessment before they use your product. And the first thing they're going to put in that privacy impact assessment is, what personal information do we handle, or what are we handing over to this vendor? And if it's low, it's going to reduce the level of scrutiny for the rest of the impact assessment and give them more confidence they can use you.
Do you find as well, I mean, you're talking about breaches in relation to, personal information that's collected by businesses. Are there other kinds of data information that is vulnerable, where, it may not be directly in relation to privacy sort of personal information, but where, of course, the information is of value to the company, and its loss or its, theft or whatever would actually create similar sort of damaging effects to the reputation or the company bottom line?
It's a really good question. Yeah, personal data is, there's so much jargon in privacy law and cybersecurity law, and so I'm sorry for that. We call it personal data in Europe and personal information in Canada for some reason. But it's such a source of risk because of the reporting obligations you have to report to the privacy commissioner and notify all the affected individuals. But there's a lot of other data that hackers are very happy to take. So you've probably signed, I mean, it's the first thing any tech startup probably signs with a customer or potential investor is an NDA. And most NDAs have an obligation to report if data has been taken without authorization or used without authorization. So you probably have contracted, like most startups, like once they've got off the ground, they've contracted with somebody that they've committed to say, if your data is stolen from us, we will tell you, and we will help you deal with it. So, and the way confidential information gets defined is quite broad. So can once an email inbox gets hacked, that's confidential information. In my world, just the fact that somebody is my client is confidential information. Then there can be more sensitive business information. With a startup, that could be about your R&D of something you want to patent. And Myra, that's maybe more your world of, if patentable subject matter gets hacked and published, can that compromise your ability to protect those patents? Trade secrets of your special sauce of what you're designing, once those are out there, they're kind of available for competitors to use, and there may not be useful protection for them. But I would say data is the most valuable to the company that was in control of it. So hackers are not, like, a next best use for data for hackers is to try and use it for phishing attempts, or phishing is a really common one, or just use it to try and commit identity theft. But that's often selling to a more like street level hacker, if I can call them that. They're like the version of the drug dealer that's selling small bags on the street, the ones who are going around doing small scale identity theft. Whereas the hackers that are breaking into systems and stealing a lot of data, they want to make one big payout for that data. They don't want to go around committing identity theft against single individuals. So they're going to come back to you and they're going to try and ransom that data back to you. And they're not going to say, they might say, we'll put this on the internet, whatever. But if they've got your customers' information, even if it's not personal information, it's just stuff they've sent you, they'll go to your customers and say, they'll threaten to go to your customers and say, we're going to tell your customers that you don't have good data security, how easy it was to hack you, that you sold our data to them, that you're actually, nefarious kind of character, and your business is in the business of tricking customers into giving you their information to sell them. So there's a lot of different ways they can extort you.
We have about 5 minutes remaining, and I, now sort of just to turn it again to this question of, since we have you here and you're able to sort of give of your expertise. So you'd mentioned sort of some of the initiatives that startups could, initiate fairly, in a cost-effective way, and would be a prudent measures to take. Are there any other that you would recommend? Sort of other, I mean, everything seems overwhelming. At the end of the day, I'm hearing you say that there's really maybe no way to actually prevent 100% sort of a cyber incident, but that the idea is to mitigate the risk as much as possible, and obviously comply with legal obligations of disclosure, et cetera. Are there other sort of things you found useful, or that other sort of early stage companies or startups might have done to sort of reduce risk? You mentioned insurance. You mentioned sort of going through a cyber attack exercise. I think about it, in the context you're talking about, NDAs or other agreements that people are signing. I mean, I don't know how many people really read the fine print and sort of really get to understand what exactly they're committing to. What kinds of prudent practices would you sort of recommend, as a sort of in a more general way that companies could follow from the very beginning?
Myra, it's a good question. So mine's like, if there's one thing for folks who are listening, if there's one thing you take away, it's just that cybersecurity needs to be top of mind at all times. It really is a mindset thing. Businesses can get a false perception that it's like a one and done thing, like you do a pen test on your systems and it comes out clean, or you remediate the risks and then you're done and you don't need to think about it for 3 more years. It's an ongoing part of daily life now. And Myra, you're right. Like nothing is hacker proof, although inevitably human error is part of every incident. Every business eventually will get hacked. It's just kind of a question of how bad the hack is and how well you respond to it. Keep in mind that like your business might be an attack vector for another business. Your employees may be an attack vector, whether it's because they just are not alive to certain issues. They accidentally, give away a login because they click a link that they think is real, and it asks them to enter their login information and their credentials get compromised. Certain cost cutting measures, if you're doing certain outsourcing, especially during COVID, unfortunately, can be a source of risk. So like ongoing education is part of every big business's sort of cybersecurity preparedness, where they're doing training programs, they're doing white hat exercises where they're, leaving USB drives sitting around their office and see who plugs one into their computer, or they're doing targeted phishing at their own business to see who falls for the phishing email. Those are kind of fun and easy to do, but they're good for the mindset, and they're also good for run them against the people who think they know what they're talking about, like me, and remind them that nobody is fraud proof. I kind of mentioned earlier that there's a lot of free resources out there, whether it's a privacy impact assessment form or cybersecurity frameworks. As I mentioned, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity's got a really good framework. Make sure there's somebody within your organization, and if you're an organization of one, that means you. If you're an organization of 2, that means one of you, who's responsible for cybersecurity. It's some of the things you can do as a startup are a lot easier than doing as a big business. So one is a data map, like just have it sketched out what data you're collecting and where it lives, and update that map. And then do data minimization, where you're just minimizing the amount of data you collect. Don't use your email inbox as storage for data. Like get it out of there if you can, because business email compromise is such a big attack, and it's such a nightmare trying to go through an inbox to find out what was even compromised. It's not structured the way you know, a traditional database can easily be searched. It's kind of a nightmare figuring out even what was compromised and who you need to notify. So that data minimization is really important. But again, I'll say it again. It's a lot about a mindset. It's just realizing that cyber risk is part of your business, and doing little things, doing regular things, good hygiene is just super important for protection.
Well, thank you. I mean, this concludes sort of the formal portion of the fireside chat. And so now let's move to the Q&A portion of the event. So for anyone who's out there who has questions, please put them in the Q&A. I will go through them. We have a couple of questions here already, and we can sort of direct them to Jade. So the first question in the Q&A is sort of mobile product and services more and more are using the microphone and camera that create user vulnerability. What risks and legal liability should entrepreneurs be aware of when launching their product or service? Thank you for the question. It's from David Best.
Yeah, David, thank you for that question. Yeah, we're all surrounded by microphones. If I tried to count, there's probably 4 microphones that can hear me right now, just in my little home office. And same with cameras. So when you're launching a product or service, I think there's an area of risk I didn't talk too much about, but it was that case of that startup I mentioned that was devalued as a result of an incident. And it was because they were over collecting. And same with the situation I mentioned where credit cards were being scraped off a website by an analytics provider. That's over collecting. And if you're developing a product or service that uses a camera or microphone, transparency is particularly important there because of the risk that you'll be perceived as over collecting data or engaging in surveillance of your customers. It's one area where people are kind of taken aback, where they look at location data was a really big one recently, where privacy commissioners got really worried about that because the New York Times published a report explaining how much location data companies were collecting about people, and not generalized location data like specific address. And you can tell quite a bit about a person just based on the locations they visit. So that smartphones then, for security reasons, started using pop-ups that explain location data and what's being used. And now your iPhone will tell you, this app has checked your location 5 times in the last 3 days. Do you want to keep letting them see your location at all times? And that kind of thing. The same issue arises with speakers and microphones, where people were concerned about how much their Alexa devices were collecting about them in terms of their voice recording. And another big privacy concern right now is voice-based profiling, like trying to see what you can do. It's kind of a bleeding edge topic, but what you can learn about somebody by their voice. Like, will AI one day be able to tell by the sound of my voice how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking about, and can I be persuaded? Can that information be used to persuade me to buy more products, essentially? So back to the point here is, the answer to your question, I think, is transparency and data minimization. So if you don't need to take recordings with your product or services, don't. If you're going to, have an opt-in, ideally with a just-in-time notice. So it's not an explanation buried in a privacy policy. It's something the user can see right away. And I mean, you're going to have a lot of opt-outs, and that's kind of the way things are going in Canada. But people are a little more sympathetic to a new business than if you explain, or to a startup. And if you explain why and say what you're doing with it, they may be a little more willing to say, if you say what we do is we record your voice and we delete it after 48 hours, after we use it to train our system to become better at understanding our customers, that's something people may feel a lot safer with than just saying, hey, can we use your voice for marketing purposes?
Okay, the next question is from Yvonne Pilon. What's the best first step for startups to take to get themselves prepared and protected? And I know you alluded to some of them, but if you had one, what would be the best way for a startup to begin?
Oh, if there's only one thing, have a tabletop exercise, maybe. Get the whole crew together and do go through what a breach looks like, and you can find tabletop exercises sort of online of what it really looks like. And I only say that because I think it's a useful tool for informing that mindset. Going through that exercise really shows you like, oh, wow, we didn't think about these 30 different things. And this is, these are real risks. And then it kind of, because it's the activity itself is illuminating and fun, people engage with it, and that will help build the mindset within your business.
So it is about creating the culture that, keeps these issues, as you say, sort of top of mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Because those people are your eyes and ears in a lot of ways. If you've got 5 employees, if they're all reporting to you every time something fishy happens, that's a lot better than people who are trying to bury their mistakes. And Myra, to culture too, you don't want a culture where people are inclined to bury their mistakes. This happens with cybersecurity incidents a lot, where in a medium-sized enterprise, the people who were responsible for defending often are inclined to minimize the incident when it happens, or minimize what happened, because they're human, and that's normal. Like we all screw up, and we all don't want to be forthcoming about it. But in a tabletop exercise, you can communicate to those people that there's going to be no repercussions. Like nobody's getting fired, nobody's even going to get blamed when we get hacked, and the expectation being that we will get hacked. And the odds are it's like a plane crash. Like planes don't crash for one pilot error. They crash because a pilot error compounded with a maintenance issue where maintenance wasn't done, compounded with a manufacturer's defect, compounded with that. Every incident has multiple points of failure. So it's good to get people out of that mindset that there's going to be blame, and you get a culture of being, transparent about cybersecurity.
Okay, there's a question from Afshin Rahimi, and I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name, but how important is student information and data when dealing with educational institutions?
Educational institutions are going to be probably some of your more, conservative when it comes to cybersecurity. Now, I've worked on data breaches for schools before. They don't necessarily have the resources to be doing huge amounts of due diligence on all of their vendors, but they are very much worried about that personal information of their students. Big universities are going to have the resources, and they're going to be very concerned. Schools that are acquiring through purchasing groups, whether it's their Ministry of Education within their province, or if it's a purchasing group where a bunch of schools have gotten together and buy technology together, they're going to have the ability to do quite a bit of diligence, and they're going to be probably the highest expectations you see out of a company. I've worked on these kinds of deals before, so they see it as really sensitive, and it's cybersecurity is a selling point to them, I think. There also may be one thing I should also mention is there's data residency requirements in the public sector sometimes. In BC right now, we've got significant data residency. So you want to be able to show Canadian educational institutions that you keep their data in Canada, ideally. Although there's proposals in BC right now. We've got a bill before our legislature to remove that requirement, because data sovereignty is something I could talk about for hours, because I'm embarrassed to say that, but I can. It's not the right way to protect personal information. Like strong encryption is way more important than where the data is located.
We have time for one final question from Ishan Sharma. So is it worth outsourcing our firm's important data and store it in a cloud database? Would that ensure that it's safe and more optimized? So taking us back to that question of third-party outsourcing the data, important data, and to store it in a cloud database.
Yep. It's become just so common for businesses to be hosting on cloud. And in one way, I mean, cloud really empowered our current startup world, because you can buy all the compute power you need as a service basis, rather than having to buy servers that run your software. It's become so important. my answer to the question is it's almost inevitable that you don't have another option other than hosting on a cloud provider. But you know, it's not going to be. Let me phrase it this way. I've seen startups say that, you know, we have ISO 27001 we're ISO 27001 certified, got all these protections, and then you dig in when you're acting for the buyer of their technology. You dig in, it's actually they just host on AWS, or they just host on Google Cloud, or they host on Azure Cloud, and the cloud service they have has that level of protection. But that's at the server level. It's not at the application level. It's at the application. Like if you're hosting on a big reputable cloud provider, yeah, nobody's going to be able to. If anybody figures out where their data centers actually are they going to break in and be able to steal servers? Probably not. That would be the highest hanging fruit for a hacker. Where the low hanging fruit is you know, the application level where credentials are compromised and that data is stolen right off of those clouds, but it's stolen through the front door through your own logins, and it's not really the responsibility of the cloud vendor anyway. It's the responsibility of the business. So it's not a bad idea to use those. I mean, but ultimately remember that there's a lot of attack vectors that are not closed by using a cloud vendor.
Thanks very much for that, Jade. And actually, thank you everyone for your questions. This ends the Q&A portion of the session, and I'll turn the floor over to Leanne.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Myra and Jade, for sharing knowledge and insight with us today. On behalf of Founders Week YQG, we can't wait to celebrate your continued success and growth. We have a very quick survey to all our attendees today. I'm just going to put it in the chat box right now. Please click on the link in the chat box to provide feedback for this session. This will enter you for a session giveaway to win a $50 Windsor card. The more sessions you provide feedback for, the more entries you have in the final draw. So because we are on Zoom right now, I can't get everybody to be in a photo. So Myra and Jade, would you mind just kind of smiling real big for me while I take a screenshot? Just one more second. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Please don't forget to check out our schedule for upcoming events. Next up on our schedule, we have a fireside chat with Kat Pasquatch, Culture Shock Bead Co. and Sarah Hafling of the Made It Happen podcast at 12 p.m. Also, we just want to ensure that you don't miss our Founders Week YQG Town Hall and Failure Night. Make sure to add them to your schedule so that you don't miss out. In case you missed it, Founders Week is offering a week of perks while quantities last. Please check out the Fun Freebies tab to learn more. Thank you so much again for joining us today and kicking off Founders Week YQG with us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.